Are we ready for bring the jury in and your next witness?
Yes, Your Honor. Will you call Mark Osterman?
Well, we'd have to get the jury in first. That's okay. Let's go ahead and bring the jury in. And please call your next witness.
Today we call Mark Osterman.
Raise your right hand, please. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that your testimony of these proceedings will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
Yes, I do.
Thank you.
You may. Yes, you may.
You state your name for the record, please, sir.
Mark Osterman,
And could you spell your last name?
Osterman.
And do you work for a federal agency, sir?
Yes, I do. Federal Air Marshal Service.
Okay. How long have you been so employed?
Since December of 2001.
Okay. Do you know a person by the name of George Zimmerman?
Very well.
Okay. And is he seated here in the courtroom today?
Yes, he is.
See, the person just stood up.
Yes, he is.
Your Honor, the record reflect the witness identified defendant, George Zimmerman.
The record will so reflect.
And how long have you known him approximately?
At least 5 years.
Okay. And you knew him back in February of 2012, is that correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And would you consider him a very good friend?
Best friend I've ever had.
Okay. I want to draw your attention to February 26th, February 27th, the evening of February 26th, 27th. Did you get a call and you end up responding to the retreat at Twin Lakes?
I did.
And did you meet the defendant's wife, Shelley Zimmerman, there?
I did.
Okay. Later the following morning, early morning of the 27th, did you come into contact with the defendant, George Zimmerman?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And did you transport him somewhere with his wife, Shelley Zimmerman?
I did.
Okay. Did he make some statements to you regarding what he alleged happened regarding the shooting he was involved in?
Yes, he did.
Okay. And did he specifically state that that Sunday night, the 26th, he had was going shopping at Target?
Correct.
Any objection, Your Honor, leading?
Okay. If you could, tell us what the defendant told you, and let me set the setting if I could. You were with yourself, and I believe you were driving, is that correct?
I drove myself.
Okay.
You
I apologize.
before.
I believe I got to rephrase the question.
Right,
I apologize. Confusion on my part. When Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, was telling you something about what happened, he was in the car with you, is that correct?
That is correct.
And were you driving?
I was.
And was his wife, Shelley Zimmerman, in the car with you and him?
She was.
Okay. And did he make some statements regarding what had happened regarding the shooting?
He did.
Okay. If you could tell us what the defendant said regarding what he alleged happened.
George said that on that Sunday night, he had left his home, as he did every Sunday night, to get lunches for the week. And as he was going to go to Super Target, which is really, really close to his home, he was going to. He just drives out of his neighborhood, and I think it was dark that night. And on his way there is when he observed someone in a black hoodie and someone who was looking like someone he had not seen before. And he knew most of the people in his neighborhood. So he had observed someone walking through the neighborhood with a hoodie on, looking either into windows or looking around residences and such.
All right. Let me interrupt you if I could. Did he describe the individual he said?
He did.
How did he describe him?
Tall, about 6 foot, and about slender build.
And he stated the person was doing something, you said?
He said walking through between two sets of townhomes. When you look to your left and right, you would look into windows. You wouldn't be in a position really to look into either the front door or such, but it was side windows.
Yes, sir. Did he further describe the individual by race or ethnicity?
Well, at that time, he knew that he was a black male.
Okay. I apologize. I interrupted you. You said, what else did the defendant tell you regarding what happened?
He said then when he realized that the person that was walking through the neighborhood was someone he didn't know, he didn't recognize, and someone who usually looks through a neighborhood while it's raining, it's suspicious, because a lot of times juveniles will walk through neighborhoods or people who are suspicious will walk through neighborhoods while it's raining because you get less people walking around, walking their dogs, or just taking an evening walk. So someone who might want to be a little more suspicious, if they're acting suspicious, they'll do it when it's dark and when it's raining, and that might have been a trigger he had said to me.
Right, okay. What I want to do is focus as best you can in terms of what you recall him saying as opposed to...
I'm sorry.
No, that's all right.
Yeah, he said he observed what is now, we realize is Trayvon, walking between the two buildings, and then he came down and he observed him, thought it was suspicious, and that he was going to call the non-emergency number for the Sanford Police Department.
Did he state that the individual that we're referring now as Trayvon Martin starts toward him and came under the light, and so he was using his phone?
Correct. George was using his. I'm sorry. Did you mention George was using his phone or Trayvon?
What did he say?
I was never told by George that Trayvon was using his phone.
I'm sorry, that
George was.
I apologize.
Correct.
George Zimmerman was using his phone.
Correct. He dialed the non-emergency number, and he wanted to make sure that he called that line instead of the 911 line.
Did he say the person you know now as the victim, Trayvon Martin, approached this car?
Walked close at this point.
Okay. What does he say about that, if you could?
Walked down to the street about where, because George had remained in his vehicle, and Trayvon had walked down, I guess down to the sidewalk area, walked a little further away, walked back a bit, and then George had, I believe, pulled into the front of their clubhouse and parked his vehicle there and waited for Sanford Police to arrive and
okay. Does he say, I apologize, I interrupted you, sir.
No, I'm sorry,
Okay. Did he say that the person you now know is Trayvon Martin? When I say he, I'm talking about the defendant, George Zimmerman.
Right.
That he walked up to the passenger side window and stood there for a moment, then goes to the front of the car, comes around to my window, my driver's side, then towards the rear of my car, then walks away?
Yeah, it was walked around the vehicle, very in close proximity, and I think they looked at each other, George had said.
Okay. Did he, the defendant, then say that at some point then he lost sight of the person you now know as Trayvon Martin?
Yes, briefly.
And do you recall then in terms of Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was talking to the dispatch or to the non-emergency person, correct?
Yes.
And did he tell you that in terms of whether he was asked, are you following him? And he answered, yes, I'm following him, but he didn't see Trayvon Martin at that time and was looking for him?
Well, there's kind of two, as George described it to me, there were kind of two phases of the contact. The first one was when he first saw him, and then he pulled into the clubhouse parking lot. And then the second one was when he reestablished contact with Trayvon, who walked down another side street that wasn't the main street around the circle. And then he backed his car up, and then he tried to keep a visual contact with him, so he followed him with his car. And he didn't get out of his vehicle until he lost visual sight of him.
And then do you recall the defendant telling you that the officer or the dispatcher, I use officer just because they're with the police department, saying to the defendant that we don't need you to follow him, and he said okay?
Correct. That was at the point where he had already gotten out of his car first. And as he described it to me, there were two reasons for getting out of the car. First, he didn't know the street. I guess he was on that center street. It's a smaller street. He didn't know the actual name of it, so he got out of his car to try to establish a visual contact to try to direct the police officer in to meet with Trayvon and dispel his suspicions and to find the exact address. Because as a police officer, you always want to know the exact address of where you're going.
All right. And then he told you, I'm sorry, the defendant, I apologize for using pronoun, that he started walking and then he put his phone somewhere?
He put his phone in his pocket after the dispatcher told him they didn't need him to follow him. So he was going to walk back to his vehicle. Okay.
And then he said something happened at that point?
He told me that as he was walking back to his car down the dog path, that Trayvon had confronted him, had walked towards him and confronted him, and they had a verbal. Okay.
And what do you recall a defendant telling you that Trayvon Martin told him, and what did he say in response?
He cursed. I'm not going to curse here today. He said, do you have a problem? And then he used a curse word.
All right. Now, you wrote a book about this, right?
I did.
And you wrote a book where you quoted what the defendant, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
And do you recall in that book writing, do you have a problem? That's what he said Trayvon Martin said.
Right. Correct.
Okay. And you didn't put in that book anything about a curse word at all?
I believe I did.
You did? Okay.
I believe I did. Do you have a problem? And then he used the initials MF.
Okay. May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
Yes, you may.
I'm going to show you your own book. And unless I got the wrong page, I'm on page 28, counsel. Just to refresh your memory.
Correct.
And don't read from it. That's
Okay.
just to refresh your memory.
All right. Yeah, he had told me that, do you have a problem? And then the curse word, it was taken out of the book because it was pretty graphic. And I didn't wanna-
Okay. So you on purpose, you took it out.
I think the publisher had
Okay.
asked that not be put in.
Because you put on there, do you have a problem? And then Mr. Zimmerman, that you said, replied, no, I don't have a problem.
Correct. And it was
But you believe the words were actually what now that the defendant said?
MF.
Okay, so these juries have heard, so just to the record to be
Okay,
clear.
I just
He
don't-
said, do you have a problem, motherfucker?
Correct.
Okay. And then the defendant, Mr. Zimmerman, said in reply, no, I don't have a problem. And then Mr. Trayvon Martin replied?
You do now.
Okay. And the defendant claimed that Trayvon Martin, was coming at him at that time?
He was very close, probably within an arm's or 2 arms reach.
Okay.
And George lost contact visually.
And I apologize.
Okay.
I
I'm sorry. Go right
interrupted
ahead. Go right ahead. No, he, as George was reaching down to get to his phone to reestablish contact with the dispatch, that's when physical contact happened.
So the defendant told you that he has these words with Trayvon Martin,
Correct.
and then he said that he went and reached for his phone in his pocket.
Correct. And looked down.
I'm sorry, he looked down.
He looked down to reach to get into his pocket.
And at that point is when Trayvon Martin hits him?
Struck him in the nose.
Okay. So the defendant claims he looked down, and that's when Trayvon Martin hit him.
Well, he looked down, got his phone, and he said as he looked back up, he lost visual contact for maybe a second to get his phone out of his pocket. He went like this, and as he looked up, the punch came squarely in his face.
So the defendant say he took the phone out or left it in his pocket?
I don't remember that.
Okay.
I don't remember.
And then what did the defendant claim after he claims the victim hit him in the nose?
He stumbled backwards and found himself on his back,
Okay.
partially on the grass, partially on the sidewalk.
Did he say what the victim, Trayvon Martin, was doing at that point?
He moved forward and got on top of him.
Did he describe to you how he got on top of him?
His knees were up somewhere near his chest or up near his armpits,
Okay.
and he was beginning to punch him.
Okay, so the defendant is claiming that the victim straddled him, I guess?
Correct.
And his knees were up in his ribs and near his armpits, correct?
Correct.
And he began punching him.
That's what George said.
And I apologize. He began punching Trayvon Martin.
Correct.
Okay.
Trayvon began punching George Zimmerman.
I'm sorry. Then I got it backwards. Sorry. The defendant's claiming he's on the ground.
And
Trayvon Martin is straddling
was
him.
punching him.
And-
George. I'm sorry.
I apologize, Mr. Osman.
I'm sorry. He said that he was on his back, and Trayvon Martin straddled him and began punching him in the face.
But the way he described Trayvon Martin straddling the defendant, he claims that you said his knees were up to his rib cage or armpits. Is that correct?
Somewhere around there, correct.
Yes. Then he said, what?
Well, George began screaming for help at that point.
Did he say anything about the defendant grabbing his head and doing something with his head?
Absolutely. Once he started screaming, George said Trayvon grabbed his head and started bashing his head on the concrete, which his upper half of his body was on the dog path.
Right. In fact, I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, saying that he was 8 inches from the grass, correct?
About, as George was explaining it, this upper half of him, somewhere of this where it was still on the concrete, where the rest of his body was on the grass.
And I think your quote is, I noticed that I'm about 8 inches away from the grass. Correct?
Correct.
And then does Mr. Zimmerman, defendant, tell you that I tried to maneuver the body just enough to get my head onto the grass?
It was a squirm, he said. He said as he was squirming down towards the grass to keep his head from getting hit by the concrete, he says his jacket kind of remained still as you squirm. His jacket, since it wasn't buttoned, it stayed where it was, and his body moved towards the grass a little bit more.
What else did he say about anybody seeing this or coming out?
He said there were several people that came out, at least two that he saw that came out, and he directly screamed for help towards those people. So as he was screaming, it was more directed at someone.
And did he say one of the individuals that came out was a man, and he yelled directly at him, and the man just went right back in?
He stated he was going to call 911 and he wasn't going to get involved.
And did he say then there was other individuals that saw this too, correct?
Perhaps at least one other, for sure, that witnessed what was happening. It may have been the same person that had the flashlight that showed up later.
I think you can refer, if you need to refresh your memory, on page 28 where you quoted Mr. Zimmerman. Did you not, at the very bottom of page 28 of your book?
There were several people.
I think you said 2 other men saw us out there and did nothing.
Correct.
Correct?
I believe so. At least one other, maybe 2 others.
And then he claimed that Mr. Martin, or Trayvon Martin, was still on top of him and took his hands and put it over his nose, correct?
One hand was trying to cover his nose, one hand was trying to cover his mouth to keep him from screaming.
Right. And I think you quoted Mr. Zimmerman as saying that Trayvon Martin put his hand, takes one of his hands and puts it over my nose and pinches it closed while his other hand goes over my mouth.
It was described to me something like this, maybe a pinch, maybe not like that, but a pinch like that and a cover.
So, in other words, Trayvon Martin is using one hand over his nose and then one hand over his mouth, correct?
It's something to that effect.
And then, what does Mr. Zimmerman, the defendant, say happened then?
He said that because his jacket rode up a bit, that perhaps with the inside of his leg, he felt or looked down and saw that he had a holster and a firearm.
Okay. Before the defendant said that, did he say that he desperately got both of my hands around the guy's one wrist and took his hand off my mouth long enough for me to shout again for help?
Right. That was the main thing he did with his hands, was to try to clear his mouth. Because with his mouth free, he could scream and he could breathe.
Okay. So the defendant is describing to you that Trayvon Martin's got one hand pinching or going his nose, and then he's got the other hand over his mouth, right?
Trying
he can't breathe or
correct.
Have I got that right?
Correct.
And then the defendant is claiming that he took his hands and removed at least one hand off of Trayvon Martin.
Off of his own mouth.
Okay. The defendant's claiming that he never hit Trayvon Martin at that time, or never just knocked him off of him, right?
That was not described to me.
Okay. And then the defendant told you he had a brief control of the wrist, but then he said, I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg, correct?
Say that one more time, sir?
For a brief moment, I had control of the wrist, but I knew when he felt the sidearm at my wrist with his leg.
That's when he let go of the other hand let go, and he said that he went for the gun.
Okay. Did he
Grabbed
say
for it.
Trayvon Martin went for the gun, correct?
Grabbed for the gun.
Okay. And I think you quoted him as saying he took his hand that was covering my nose and went for the gun, saying something at that point, correct?
He did.
He said, what words did he utter?
He says, you're going to die, and he used the MF term again. I'm sorry, I don't like to curse from ladies.
And for the record, he used the word, you're going to die now, motherfucker, correct?
That is correct.
And then I think you got the defendant quoted as saying, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, correct?
Could have been the leather, could have been the gun.
Well, I think you quoted him on page 29, and refresh your memory if you need to.
Correct.
As, under quotations, somehow I broke his grip on the gun when the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer. So
That's where the leather strap is, though. That's what holds the gun in.
So the defendant is claiming that the victim actually grabbed the gun,
That was my understanding, that he grabbed the gun. That would have been the only place that was available to grab.
And then he said the defendant, managed to get the gun in his hand and raised it towards Trayvon Martin's chest and pulled the trigger, correct?
Unfortunately, yes.
And then he claims after he shot Trayvon Martin that Trayvon Martin sat up and he heard him say, "You got it, okay, you got it," something like that.
Correct.
And then that Trayvon Martin pivoted 90 degrees and fell face forward onto the grass, and he scooted from under him.
Correct.
And the defendant claims he didn't know he shot him.
He didn't know he struck him, correct.
I'm sorry, struck him.
Correct.
In fact, the defendant went on to tell you that he thought Trayvon Martin, I know he wasn't calling him Trayvon Martin.
I understand.
I think he referred to him as the guy or whatever. Might try to get up again. So after putting his gun back in the holster, he jumped on top of Trayvon Martin and pinned him down, correct?
Correct.
And then he said a man approached him out of the darkness and
First
thought it
man
the
was
police,
not.
correct?
First man was not a police officer. The second was.
And you recall also that when he's describing in terms of the first contact he had out there when he was calling the non-emergency number, that he said, "We need you to get to a place where you can see him," in terms of observing Trayvon Martin?
Right. Well, that's. He had said that he had to get somewhere where he could observe Trayvon or observe any subject that's in his neighborhood to be able to direct police officers to them. So whether he actually, whether the dispatch actually said, "We need you to move to where you can see them," I'm not sure if that actually was what occurred. But he had said that his instructions from Sanford Police, whenever they came to their complex, was always to get to where you can observe and try not to make contact.
And he told you that the officer was almost there at the scene in about 45 seconds or something, or the dispatch was telling him that, correct?
Well, I guess time is relative at that point, but yes, very, very shortly after.
I'm saying when he's talking, he's saying the dispatcher's telling him the officer's almost there. He's
Correct.
within 45 seconds.
Correct.
And he told you that, and I'm going back now in terms of when the dispatcher, he tells you that he told the dispatcher to just have the officer meet me at the clubhouse, correct?
That is correct.
And that he put his phone in his pocket to turn around to head back to the car when the guy is there about 15 feet away from walking towards him, right?
Correct.
So he's saying that Trayvon Martin, I apologize, I'm using the name Trayvon Martin, but you know who I'm talking about.
Correct.
He's describing this person is 15 feet away and walking towards him, correct?
Correct.
He said some other words, MF, but you didn't put it in the book, correct?
Correct.
He also told you that when he managed to get his hand off of Trayvon Martin's hands off his mouth, that he had control of the wrist, correct?
To some degree, to prevent him from putting it back over his mouth, yes.
Right. And he told you that the defendant, managed to break the grip on the gun where the guy grabbed it between the rear sight and the hammer, correct?
Whether it was the gun or the leather casing or just reaching down there and grabbing something.
Right, but I
He
think,
broke the grip of the gun or the holster.
now, you didn't refer to the holster when you wrote it down in the book, correct? You just put gun.
Correct.
Right.
Because
Okay.
the holsters, that's exactly the place where the holster holds the firearm in place. So whether it was actual firearm or holster, I didn't see a difference. If someone grabs a hold of the holster or grabs a hold of the gun, their intent is probably the same.
And the defendant's telling you then that he shot at Trayvon Martin, but he didn't know whether he struck him or not. He
Correct.
thought the shot went wide, correct?
He did say that.
Tell me that moment you're on. Further questions?
Thank you, Cross.
Yes, you should. Morning, sir. How are you?
Fine, sir.
How long have you been in law enforcement?
Since 1992,
Okay. Pretty much a career for you?
it is.
And you enjoy doing what you do?
Very much.
Did you get any college training or anything before going to the police academy?
Well, not before the police academy. I had, right out of high school, I went into the Army. I was in the U.S. Army Infantry. And when I got out, I then applied directly to the Daytona Beach Community College Police Academy.
Completed that and then been in law enforcement ever since?
Correct.
And you've discussed your career with George Zimmerman, have you not?
In detail.
And it was actually you who assisted him when he decided that he needed a firearm, correct?
That is correct.
And did he tell you the reason why he wanted to get a firearm?
He asked whether he should or shouldn't to start with,
Okay.
and I recommended that he should. That anybody who's a non-convicted felon should carry a firearm.
That's your sort of life philosophy?
That's my opinion. Correct.
Being armed is better than not being armed?
The police aren't always there.
And you then encouraged him to do that?
I told him if he wished to go and go to a place that actually trains for the concealed weapons permit and to get that training.
Which you know that he did, right?
He did do.
And that he actually got his concealed weapons permit?
I believe him and his wife.
And then they need to decide what weapon that they should or he should purchase, correct?
That is correct.
And did he seek your counsel in that regard?
He did.
And
Objectives to be on the scope of correct.
Sustained.
let's focus then a bit more. How long did you know George?
About 5 years. Well, at that time, it was a little over about 4 years at that time.
Okay. And I think you said he's your best friend?
Best one I've ever had.
Would that affect in any way your testimony here today that he's a good friend of yours?
Well, not as far as the truth is.
Okay. So you're going to speak the truth, good or bad, for Mr. Zimmerman?
Correct.
And as part of that friendship, you were contacted on the night that this event happened?
I was.
Okay. And offered you help when, and I guess helped Shelley, who was going through what she was going through, right?
Near hysterical. She had called me from, she was visiting her father's home at the time when she received a call from a neighbor from Twin Lakes. And then she immediately called me. And both of us got into our vehicle and arrived at Twin Lakes about within 10 seconds of each other.
And how upset was she?
Indescribably hysterical. She had almost no information to go on because the neighbor, I guess, that called, they had to hang up. So she couldn't get further updates as to George's health or status or what he had. She was, I put my arm around her just to kind of keep her from blacking out, I guess.
Because at that point, she had gotten a phone call from somebody who actually said that George was involved in a shooting, correct?
She told me that she got a call that said George was involved in a shooting in handcuffs and bloody.
you arrive at
Crime scene tape was surrounded. It was a massive area that they had circled off, so we couldn't get very close to the actual scene itself. But inside the crime scene tape was a Sanford police officer car. In the back seat of the police officer car, Shelley and I saw someone who she more quickly identified as probably being George lean his head down and lay down from the back seat. And he supposedly he had laid straight down to where no one could see him.
And did you have any contact with him at that point?
None. Couldn't get anywhere close.
Okay. Then at some point you went to Sanford Police Department, correct?
Correct. I drove Shelley over to the Sanford Police Department and we waited in their lobby until he was released.
Do you recall about how many hours you were there?
Goodness. 2 or 3 a.m. Could have been even longer.
What was his state of mind when you finally saw him at 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning?
Stunned. He immediately attempted to reassure Shelley, who broke down again once she saw him. Once they got out of the elevator, she went into hysterics, kind of a breakdown, maybe not hysterics, but went into a sobbing breakdown. And he immediately tried to reassure her he was okay, and so he was more occupied with her than with anything else. But he had a stunned look on his face.
And when you say stunned, tell
wide-eyed, just kind of a little bit detached, perhaps from maybe not realizing he had just gone through a traumatic event. Kind of odd to describe, very, very difficult to describe it.
Let's talk about, obviously, as a good friend for him for the 5 years prior, or 4 years prior, you've known him, correct?
Oh, yes.
And then tell the jury, if you would, how he was that night compared to the George Zimmerman you knew most other days.
That's what I was using to base my observation on, was a more wide-eyed stare. Again, once he saw Shelley, he focused more on making sure she was reassured and that letting her know that he's okay, he doesn't have anything fatal or anything going on with him. He's all right. And she immediately started to observe. Once she got out of her shock at seeing George, she then started kind of looking at his injuries, and I guess she kind of went into nurse mode at that point because she was a nursing student.
And again, how is George presenting himself to you?
Detached. It's hard to describe.
Well, is detached different from the way he normally is?
Oh, vastly.
When you say detached, what do you mean?
I would say probably when you feel like you've. It's hard to describe, sir. I would say he was probably in a position where he was not able to process. His mind wasn't. He wasn't answering questions, because I started asking him some questions about whether he needed to sit down for a little bit, right there in the lobby, and he didn't. He just, no, I just want to go. I just want to go home, kind of thing. And it was very basic. I don't know how to really describe detached, as in wide-eyed and really not processing what was going on.
Did he seem to you to be non-emotional about what was going on?
Coming right off of the elevator, he was tending to Shelley and her sobbing and her crying. So he was focused with that. When that went down, when Shelley actually transformed from a wife concerned for her husband to being a nurse, that's when he kind of just had a blank stare.
And then at some point you guys got in the car, correct?
Went to my vehicle, correct.
And then let's talk about the conversations that he did have with you. So give us the setting, if you would, as to how this conversation that at some point in the future you relayed as far as your direct examination. So sort of give us the setting for what happened.
Okay. We get into my vehicle. Both Shelley and George got into the back seat. I had a 4-door vehicle. They both got in the back seat, and Shelley is trying to put an assessment on the injuries that were to George's nose, the back of his head, and he had a swelling on his left side of his head. It was about the size of your fist. It was a swollen area, not really a goose egg, not as pronounced as that, but it was a very big swollen area. I'm sorry, and with his hair being closely cropped like mine, you could see it very well. I guess if he had a lot more hair, you would not have been able to see it as well. But she started tending to that, stating that we needed to get ice on it and such. And when we got stating that she needed to get ice on that part of the swelling, and on the drive from the Sanford Police Department to my home, he explained from start to finish. It took about the whole time that we went from the Sanford Police Department to my home. He explained what had happened that night, because that was the first time we had known any details of anything.
Now, as he was explaining it to you, was this sort of as a friend recounting to a friend, or were you acting in law enforcement mode or as friend mode?
Well, my wife will tell you it's hard for me to get out of law enforcement mode sometimes, but I like to analyze everything I hear to make sure that it makes sense. But I would say part of his friend also. Okay.
So let's start off then, not to belabor too much with keeping in mind your direct testimony, but let's start with, he first told you he was on his way to Super Target?
Correct.
Did that seem usual or unusual to you?
Every single Sunday like clockwork.
And tell me what he said to you about him first noticing, who later became known to all of us as Trayvon Martin.
He observed Trayvon walking between two sets of townhomes and looking into, I believe there was a window to one where the light was on, and you could see that someone was looking into the window of a townhome. And it was about that time that Trayvon and George made eye contact with each other, and both aware of the other's presence.
Okay. And in that initial contact, did he seem to you as though he was angry or anything like that with who this person was?
No. George said that he wanted to make sure that he just got with non-emergency dispatch and had them send a police officer.
And he told you he did that?
Immediately.
And, of course, you know from your conversation with George that entire conversation was recorded, correct?
Yes, I do.
And from your conversations with George, both about this night and other nights, George Zimmerman certainly knows that those phone calls are recorded, correct?
Yes.
So tell me then, again, he's explained to you that Trayvon Martin is now walking up and sort of near his vehicle at some point?
Correct. Came walking from between the townhomes down to where the sidewalk or the road area was.
And are you taking any notes at this point, or are you just listening to him download?
I'm driving.
Okay. So at some point it became apparent to you that Mr. Zimmerman had stopped his car by the clubhouse, correct?
Yes, he did.
And that Trayvon Martin then came up towards his car, either looked in a window or walked partially around it?
Very close, walked around it, very close. They made eye contact several more times, very aware of each other's presence.
During this point, this sort of second eye contact, did George Zimmerman relate to you in any way that he was angry or anything about Trayvon Martin or this person who was there?
No, not at all.
And he further told you that he was still on the phone, of course, with non-emergency, right?
He remained on, correct.
So then we move forward to, I think you said that George Zimmerman did what he thought he should to keep Trayvon Martin in sight?
Correct.
Is that pretty much the way? Tell me how he related that part to you, as best you can recall.
Well, he said that he had heard from the Sanford police officers that showed up to the clubhouse to give instruction to neighborhood watch people was to always try to keep whatever subject that you're observing in sight. It makes it much easier for a law enforcement officer to show up and make contact with the subject if you're on the phone with dispatch during the whole process and you can actually see the subject.
Did he relate to you that the non-emergency dispatcher had actually told him on a couple of occasions, tell me what he's doing now or let me know if he's doing anything else?
He told me what he was doing. He didn't tell me that the dispatcher had said certain things.
Okay. So basically, George Zimmerman, as he's telling you this story, is recounting to you actions, correction?
Yes.
Correct?
Oh, yes.
Not necessarily, I did this because of this reason, or I did this, and sort of superimposing the conversation he's having with the non-emergency onto your conversation.
No, not at that time, no.
Okay. He was just saying basically a rendition of what was going on.
Correct.
And just so the jury is clear, about how long was this conversation between George Zimmerman and you during this car ride?
The drive from the Sanford Police Department to near the intersection of Reinhardt Road and Lake Mary Boulevard, which would have been about 14 minutes, 15 minutes.
And during that time, were other things being discussed as well, like whatever Shelley was doing with him?
She didn't interject at all.
Okay. So during this conversation, then, he's telling you that he's trying to keep an eye on Trayvon Martin however he can.
That was his intent,
Okay.
was to keep him under observation.
And at some point, well, tell me then, at some point did he say to you that I couldn't see him any longer, or that he lost sight of him?
That is one of the reasons why he got out of the vehicle.
And tell me how he related that to you?
He said he went in between the sets of townhomes down a dog path, a walking path.
When you say he, you mean Trayvon Martin?
What? Right. He lost contact in the darkness in between the townhomes right down that walking path, and then he got out of his vehicle it may have been at the time when someone was asking him, where's your exact location, because the officer was getting close. So as the police officer gets closer and closer to the actual scene, the dispatch likes to tell them exact street numbers so you can find your place exactly.
Okay.
So that's what he was looking for.
George Zimmerman never told you during the entirety of this conversation that George Zimmerman ever went down the dog path, correct?
He did. He left his vehicle and he
walked down the path.
Walked down the path, correct.
Do you know this area that we're talking about?
I do.
Okay. And you know there's a path that goes straight through to Retreat View Circle?
Correct.
And then a right turn that goes off to the right?
Correct.
A T.
Yes.
And he had said to you that Trayvon Martin went down the T, correct?
Perhaps, yes. That's what he believes, because the street beyond was lit better than the dog path was. So if Trayvon had gone all the way to Retreat View Circle, he would have seen him or his shadow, perhaps. Because he lost sight of him around the time where the T was, he said, I believe he made his turn down that dark dog path area that was not very well lit at all.
And tell us the path, if you recall, that George Zimmerman told you he took as he was on the phone.
He said he went straight to go through since he lost contact. He wanted to go straight through to get a house number of one
straight
through, not take the right to go down on the T, just to go straight through and find some kind of a house number, because you want to make sure you get the exact house number, because there was a lot of units there on Retreat View Circle. The exact house number would have brought the police officer faster. I believe that's what his intent was.
And he told you that he was on his way back when the altercation began, correct? And that they said whatever they said to each other, as you testified to. Just to fast forward, I think you said that you weren't taking notes during that event, correct?
I was driving, correct.
Have you ever talked to George again about the facts of this case, or was that the only time?
One other time I heard him relay the incident.
And when was that?
The next morning.
Okay. And we'll talk about that in a moment.
Okay.
During the event in the car, when he said things like, do you have a problem, you do now, or no, I don't, are those, as best you can recall, the words that George told you he remembers from the night before?
That is correct.
And talking about the actual mounting, when he said that Trayvon Martin had mounted him, I think he said that at one point he was straddling and the knees may have been up as high as the armpits. Is that correct?
Could have been. The ribs area could have been as high as the armpits.
Well, no, I'm just asking you, because what I would like to do is have you tell the jury, without presuming or suggesting ribs, armpits, hips, knees, whatever it might be, for right now, just recount, as best you recall, what George remembered of the event and what he told you.
Well, I guess during a struggle, I guess the position of his knees and legs would probably change with George squirming. So at one point, I believe they were around his ribs, with George trying to squirm off of the sidewalk and onto the grass. I guess his knees came up a little higher, and that's very possible. Or the other way around, to where it was as he's squirming, once they get closer to the grass, in a fight, I guess, or in a scrap like that, it began at least here with the ribs, where the knees are somewhere in the ribs area.
Was he consistent, however, that it was Trayvon Martin who had mounted on top of him?
If it was Trayvon
Was it?
that did
Yes.
it? Oh, absolutely.
And was he consistent that it was he, meaning George Zimmerman, who was screaming for help?
Without question.
And he did tell you at some point that there was some hand over the nose, hand over the mouth event.
Correct. But it was raining and it was slippery, I'm sure.
Did he tell you how long that portion of the overall altercation lasted?
20 seconds maybe? 15, 20, 30 seconds? He didn't mention it.
Well, again, I don't want you to assume.
No, he didn't mention it. He did not say how long.
Okay. Did that, however, as he related it to you, seem to be significant as it was occurring to him, that he couldn't breathe for whatever length of time?
Yeah, it was critical.
And that somebody had a hand, Trayvon Martin, on the nose that had already suffered the previous injury.
Correct.
And as he was relating that to you, was that sort of a real focus of his?
That was the focus. That when he was losing oxygen, he felt he was not able to breathe, and that's why he was desperate to either clear an airway.
And in your experience as law enforcement, would you agree that that's sort of a natural reaction to traumatic events?
I would think so, every time I've seen it.
And do people involved in traumatic events like that sometimes focus on particular parts of it?
Almost exclusively to the omission of others.
For example, in a car accident, you might focus on the speed of the car coming at you and completely forget about other cars around you.
Correct.
Is that unnatural in your experience as law enforcement?
No, it's typical.
So when you go to a scene of an accident or shooting or just anything that you investigate, do you find in your experience that people often have sort of tunnel vision views of what happened to them?
Sometimes very specific, correct.
Does that mean that they're lying to you when they do that?
Not at all.
Why not?
It's been proven that is typical. Sometimes they'll focus in on one event to the exclusion of others.
How about their ability to just recount events with any particularity at all?
I'm going to object this beyond the scope of the direct. I haven't objected.
And then you testified concerning this whole event around the gun. Did you have a similar concern as to Mrs. Zimmerman's ability to recount those events to you?
No.
Okay. Tell me what he did say about having to grab his gun.
He said that Trayvon had reached down and grabbed for the gun, whether it was on the leather holster or on the actual metal part itself. At the time, I didn't see a difference. I just thought that the intent was clear, and that's when he freed one of his hands and went and got the gun. He either broke contact or knocked somebody else's hand away, or Trayvon's hand away from him reaching for the gun or grabbing the gun, and then he drew it.
Do you recall if he even told you that Trayvon Martin had touched the gun, or just that he was reaching for it?
I thought he had said he had grabbed the gun. I've only heard the story twice, and whether it was grabbed the gun, grabbed for the gun, perhaps it was just the intent. But I believed he said he grabbed the gun.
So, and then he told you the rest of the story as you've related, correct?
Yes, sir.
About Trayvon Martin sort of saying something to him. Did that seem unusual to you, that someone shot could still say something?
Yes. Oh no, that's very, very common. Unless you're shot in, let's say, the windpipe and in the vocal cords, you would be able to talk for maybe 6 to 8 seconds.
Nonetheless, that George Zimmerman said that he had gotten off and actually held his hands out away from his body.
He had gotten off of George, laid down on the grass, and George had jumped on top of him to pin his hands down, and to again try to solicit some help from people that are around.
And yet, when he let the hands go, Trayvon Martin may have brought them back under him. Was that the way it was presented to you?
Speculation.
No.
I apologize for withdrawal.
Yeah. No.
Okay. Did he even talk to? Did George Zimmerman even know to talk to you about the fact that Trayvon Martin's hands were found back under his body?
I did not know that fact.
Okay. So he didn't seem to feel any need to explain that away to you, correct?
Correct.
So now let's talk about your recounting this. Well, you said that you heard a story again the next day.
Next morning.
Any differences in what we've talked about so far?
None.
Okay. And who was that discussed with or in front of?
My wife and his wife, Shelley.
And was it different in any context when it was being discussed then?
George looked different. He was not as wide-eyed, and he did not appear to be as in shock the next morning.
Now, let's fast forward. How many months until you decided to recount this in a book form?
I have to look. At least 4 months.
Okay. Did you have any conversation with Mr. Zimmerman to corroborate that what you recalled happened, or what you recall him telling you happened, was in fact accurate?
We were not able to contact each other after he was arrested the first time. So there was no contact.
All right. And so you haven't talked to him, you haven't shown him, for example, a draft of the book and say, I remember you saying this, and him saying, no, that I said this instead.
There was no cooperation with that, no.
Yeah. This is your memory 4 months later when you looked back to that night, correct?
Correct.
And just remember it as best you can 4 months later.
Correct.
You didn't take any notes that night?
None.
Or in between, did you?
No.
So it wasn't until 4 months later that you went back, sort of scoured your memory to put back together what he had told you on that night, 2 o'clock in the morning on the 27th.
Unfortunately, I did not take any notes, so it was just memory.
Okay. If you had any facts wrong that were conclusively proven wrong by forensic evidence, would you defer to the evidence rather than your memory of it?
Without question.
If, for example, he told you he shot once and there were 4 shots fired, and you had in your book that there was 1, but the forensic evidence supported 4, you would defer to that?
I'd support that 100%.
And to the extent that he may have told you something, well, you remember he told you something differently than it appears in the non-emergency call, which is recorded contemporaneous with the event, you would defer to that?
Absolutely. I may have heard wrong, or I may have documented it wrong.
And even if there was something different that he told law enforcement a few hours earlier in a recorded or videotaped interview from what you recall happening, would you defer to that?
I would.
A moment, Your Honor. And at some point during this investigation, you had an opportunity to listen to the screaming on the 911 call, correct?
Yeah, on the scope of direct.
Didn't know other questions from you.
Can you redirect?
You, as best you could, have testified and have written in your book what the defendant, your best friend, George Zimmerman, told you, correct?
Correct.
You haven't made anything up to help one side or the other, is that correct?
None whatsoever.
And as you stated, the defendant never told you that the victim had his hands underneath his body after he shot him. He said he put his hands out, right?
Correct.
Okay. And as you stated, the defendant told you that the victim, Trayvon Martin, grabbed his gun, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
Grabbed for his gun.
Well, I think you've actually...
Grabbed, right. Whether it was, again, where I guess we're going over whether it grabbed the holster part or the gun, I didn't see a difference in the two. But grabbed something.
Grabbed the gun. He didn't...
Absolutely. The gun didn't come out.
No.
But he grabbed the gun in the holster.
That's what I'm saying.
Yes, sir.
The defendant didn't tell you, Mr. Zimmerman didn't tell you he grabbed for it. He said he actually got it.
That's what I heard. That's what I thought I heard, yes.
Right. Okay. Then he told you, I thought I shot wide, but he might get up, so I put my gun in my holster.
Correct.
And he said he put the phone in his pocket, turned around to head back, and the guy was right there about 15 feet walking towards him.
Correct.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Very brief, one question in response. As to the reholstering of the weapon, do you recall if he told you that it was reholstered as he got up, if he had it in his hand when he was holding Trayvon Martin's hands down, or even at some point shortly thereafter?
He may have had it. He may have had it still in his hand as he jumped on top of Trayvon, and perhaps holstered when he saw the flashlight. I don't remember specifically when exactly he holstered his firearm.
Thank you. Nothing further.
You wrote in the book that he holstered his firearm.
He holstered his firearm at some point. Exactly when, I'm not 100% sure whether it was when he got up from, whether he stood up and reholstered, or whether he holstered while still partially on top.
Right. You want to look at your book a minute, if you could, page 29 at the bottom. Did you quote him as saying, in fact, I thought he might try to get up again, so after putting my gun in my holster, I jumped on top of him and pinned his wrist to the ground?
Correct.
Okay. Was that accurate?
As far as I remember, that he holstered, yeah, at that point, it now remembers that, I remember that it was, he holstered, pinned his hands down. It's what I remembered him saying something like that.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. May Mr. Osterman be excused?
To remain under prosecutor, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you. You're excused from the courtroom, but you're subject to being recalled. Okay, thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll go ahead and take a recess for lunch. Before you go to lunch, I'm going to advise you that during lunch you're not to discuss the case amongst yourselves or with anybody else. You're not to read or listen to any radio, television, or newspaper reports about the case. You're not to go on the internet by using any type of an electronic device to do independent research about the case, people, places, things, or a terminology. And finally, you're not to read or create any emails, text messages, Twitters, tweets, blogs, or social networking pages about the case. Do I have your assurances that you will abide by these instructions? Okay, thank you. And with that, put your notepads face down and follow Deputy Jarvis into the jury room. I didn't say what time we were going to come back, so it will be 1:30. Anything we need to take up before we recess for lunch?
No, Your Honor.
Okay, thank you all very much. We'll be at recess till 1:30.